Hey everyone, it's Anthony Fantano here. It's the internet's busiest music nerd, you know who it is. And it's time for another worst to best. Yes, I'm going over the many studio albums of thrash metal band supreme Metallica. I'm just counting core studio albums of solo original material, not the garage band album, not the S&M album, not Lulu, although that would be the best. That was a joke. I was just joking there. I wasn't serious. So without any further ado, let's just get into it. California thrash metal legends Metallica. Far from being the first metal band, or the most beloved one given the multiple controversies that they've caught themselves in over the years, to the point where, in a way, it sort of precedes the music itself. Regardless, Metallica is one of the most culturally significant metal acts of all time. I mean, they did a lot to put thrash metal and metal in general on the mainstream map. The band has multiple Grammy Awards under their belt, and globally about 100 million albums sold. So what better metal band to take on in a worst to best? Because their albums really do run the gamut from thrash metal purity to mainstream metal accessibility, from some of the worst and best music metal has to offer. And here's the worst album, the worst one. Metallica, early 2000s. Not a high point in their career. I guess since this is the first album I'm talking about, it's the lowest point. With this record, the band was essentially returning back from their biggest gap in studio albums ever. Yes, of course, they just released Garage Inc. and the S&M album, but the band was kind of coasting on the fact that they had pretty much just attained legend status, so they were kind of phoning it in with a series of projects that were mostly just like, you know, indulgent releases for hardcore fans to buy up. Fan can 1, 2, and 3, just emptying people's pockets and building up this image of Metallica as not just a band, but a brand. At this point, it was almost like Metallica could do no wrong, and they kind of tested that theory with their worst album ever, Saint Anger. The recording sessions for this album, spanned about a year, which is mind-boggling considering just how little they have to show for it. This album is easily the worst produced of any Metallica record. It's consistently muddy, it's overcompressed. From the album's opening riffs on the song Frantic to the very end, the whole thing sounds like an unrefined demo that would have been kind of dolled up or mixed properly down the road later. James Hetfield's overdubbed background vocals sound almost as loud as his lead vocals, and there's so much ambient noise around Lars's drums that it's pretty distracting, which is kind of a shame because if properly produced, some of these songs wouldn't have been that bad. Like, "My lifestyle determines my death style," which I think is a pretty sick line. You know, I do like that a lot of the performances on this record have a pretty raw and aggressive tone, which for a moment in the band's career I think kind of disappeared when they were writing some of their most accessible stuff. And Metallica was also still kind of messing with a lot of the groove metal and nu metal sounds that have been popular for the past 7 years, which I wouldn't say ruin the album, but certainly make a lot of these songs sound really obnoxious. I mean, maybe it's worse than I'm giving it credit for. I mean, Invisible Kid is easily one of the worst songs the band has ever written. James Hetfield's smooth, vocal harmonies on the track do not help. Yes, this is just the worst Metallica album, the worst sounding, the worst written Metallica album, and in my mind, there's just no debating that. Now, while I may list Death Magnetic in 2008 here as Metallica's second worst album, that's not to say that you should totally avoid it. I do think there is a sea of difference and quality between this record and Saint Anger. The production is much better, much more listenable. I mean, generally it's a little too dry and flat, but everything sounds at least balanced. It just doesn't have that extra sheen, that final waxy finish to kind of bring these tracks to the next level, which again is yet another shame in Metallica's discography because you're one of the biggest bands on the planet. You have all the resources in the world, yet on these simple, fundamental characteristics, you fall so terribly short. It just goes to show the stranglehold the industry had on music fans in the 90s and the 2000s, because labels could consistently release records that were this mediocre and still rake in huge sales. Now, Metallica's writing style on this record is more in tune with their classic thrash style, but at this point, it kind of fits like an old pair of jeans that you're too fat for now. Also, Metallica just kind of showing a general lack of ideas on this thing. The Day That Never Comes sounds like a worse version of The Unforgiven, and the second track on this thing is literally the third piece in a trilogy originally stemming from that song, The Unforgiven. And it's definitely arguable that All Nightmare Long features Kirk Hammett's most lazy guitar solo ever. Still, the riffs and the drums on this thing are pretty tight. James Hetfield's vocal performances are much more on point. This just isn't really a high point for songwriting in the band's career, and that's kind of it. Much of it is pretty redundant in the band's entire discography. A lot of tracks just sound like recycled ideas or like songs they've already written already, but lesser versions. And the record sounding as plain as it doesn't exactly help sell it either. Hardwired to Self-Destruct dropped last year, Metallica's latest record. It's long-winded, it's bloated. Overall, there's kind of a lack of refreshing ideas. But honestly, I think this record is the band's most successful return to their thrash roots that they've attempted to come through with in years. On this record, Metallica just kind of seems past the point of trying to appeal to the largest audience possible. And as a result on this thing, they just play to their strengths, what strengths they have left. And this, of course, leads to some indulgences in the track listing, but, overall, it's still a very enjoyable album. The band makes a greater effort in the lyrics here to address more social and political topics like war and violence and the military, specifically servicemen and women suffering from PTSD. I think the record is not that bad. I don't really think it's that amazing either. Maybe it'll become more significant with time. It's just kind of one of those Metallica albums that I can kind of take or leave. But certainly this is a higher artistic point than the records I've mentioned so far. The albums Load and Reload that dropped in the mid-90s. I'm going to talk about these records together in this one segment because I don't want to reuse this joke twice. Load, it's a load all right. Even bands as big as Metallica feel the pressure to change with time. And in the mid to late 90s, the metal music landscape was shifting. Thrash's seat on the metal throne was being threatened by a new generation of artists. All of these groove metal bands, all of these alt metal bands, Pantera and Machine Head and Alice in Chains and Faith No More, industrial rock and metal bands like Nine Inch Nails as well as Fear Factory. And you can kind of feel that new wave of sound seeping into Metallica's style on this one, with a lot of the tracks here not really reaching the intense thrash speeds that they would usually approach in the 80s. Some of the vocal harmonies on here were pretty moody. The slap bass line on the song Cure is kind of a weird moment for Metallica too. The guitar work on this thing is occasionally kind of brooding as well. However, nu metal is not the only influence or sound flowing throughout this album. I mean, there are some obvious nods to the world of hard rock on this thing, and there are a lot of tracks here that are kind of just, the logical artistic conclusion following a lot of the material the band had released on the Black album in 1991. Now, at the time, this record was not really well received by hardcore fans. They hated Metallica's change in sound. They hated that they, cut their hair short and had this new, slick, cleaned up style. They were selling out, I tell ya. And I certainly sympathize. I don't think this is a high point in the band's career or anything, and overall these two albums sound like the band is writing midlife crisis metal for guys who have motorcycles and pickup trucks. I mean, the song Mama Said literally has like a country twang to it. But, I personally had these albums on CD when I was a kid. I liked them at the time, and I think there are a lot of tracks that hold up on these two records if you take them out of the context of Metallica used to be a thrash metal band and they're not like thrashing as much as they used to, man. Some of the ballads for sure are very awful on this thing, like Carpe Diem Baby, and while it was incredibly overplayed, I do think Until It Sleeps is one of Metallica's better radio singles. And I'm sorry, but King Nothing still kicks ass, and so does Give Me Fuel, Give Me Fire, Give Me That Which I Desire. For a tried and true band attempting to transition into a totally new sound, it's not that awkward. It could have been a lot worse, and I think if Metallica took the best tracks from Load and Reload and just put them onto one disc, it would have been a pretty great record. And honestly, a lot of what is on these two albums sounds better than a lot of the material that the nu metal and alt metal bands were putting out at the time, many of whom have been completely forgotten at this point. And I think these two albums stand as the last real example of Metallica trying to challenge themselves artistically, if you don't count Lulu. And justice For All, the last release to drop in Metallica's fantastic run of albums in the 1980s, and their last pure thrash metal album before the band would go on to explore some more accessible sounds a few years later on the Black Album. And while this album is very good, it's probably their worst record that came out in the 80s. At this point, it's kind of apparent that the band was running out of ideas. You have some very tepid cuts on here like Eye of the Beholder, the awkward guitars and plodding drums moving their way through the To Live Is To Die instrumental don't sound like the band are performing a song, but like completing a chore. Also, the way that the acoustic intro kind of fades out and suddenly gives way to these like thudding riffs and guitars. The sudden edit right in the middle of the track that just hard transitions into these soaring guitar solos, which eventually cuts to some moody finger picking. Like, the post-production choices on this album are pretty questionable and have not really aged that well. And I'm sorry, but I cannot help but kind of giggle still at the Viking chants on the frayed ends of Sanity. Oh, wee, oh, yo, oh, wee, oh. Yo! This is easily Metallica's worst produced album of the 80s as well. The distortion is really brittle. It seems like there's like a lot of sound bleed with the guitars and the drums. The album overall is just really flat. It's really claustrophobic. It's really dry. And it's also like I've been transported to an alternate reality where bass doesn't exist. Like, trying to find Jason Newsted's bass on this album is like trying to find who shot Biggie and Pac. Now, there were some unfortunate circumstances that may have sort of influenced the downturn that was this album. Cliff Burton, the band's former bassist, had passed away while on tour as the band was promoting and performing tracks from their 1986 album Master of Puppets, which could have led to the bass not being as prominent or as interesting, which could have led to just the overall lack of ideas, or just what seems like the difficulty of writing a new crop of interesting songs with great performances. While this record is far from one of Metallica's worst projects, it does sound like the band is kind of just restless in their own sound, which does occasionally lead to some high points, some good ballads, the very epic title track. I just kind of take this album as a growing pain or a transitional moment that would eventually bring them to their widest selling album of all time. Metallica's debut 1983 album, Kill 'Em All. The band's sound on this record, it was not fully formed yet. They really wore their influences on their sleeves. I mean, so many tracks on here just bleed heavy metal. They just bleed Motorhead. They kind of bleed punk music too. But still, this is a very good album in the band's discography. It's a great debut album. It has the gutsy, fiery energy and performances that you want a new young band to have. They sound like a band with everything to gain, nothing to lose, and even though, again, it's not their best songwriting, it's not their best production, it's not the most original sound that they've ever come up with, the energy is there, the passion is there, and that's what makes the record exciting. I mean, Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning, that would come later after this, would be much catchier by comparison, but there's still plenty of highlights here. You have the throttling Whiplash, the epic and multifaceted Four Horsemen, the incredibly groovy No Remorse, and that killer hook on Jump in the Fire! The Pulling Teeth instrumental is mostly handled by Cliff Burton's amazing bass playing. His screaming, distorted arpeggios and riffs and solos are like amazing. He was just an incredible talent that unfortunately died in the way that he did, died when he did. It just would have been interesting to sort of see where Metallica could have gone or where they would have been had he been alive, to see the band's entire career. This is a very young Metallica. This is a Metallica still trying to find itself, but some of their best musical moments still land on this record, and this is easily one of their most solid track lists too, which makes it a pretty easy pick for like their top 4 albums. For Metallica's third best album, I'm going Black Album. 16 million copies of this thing sold in the US alone. And that's for good reason. This record is most likely the most popular metal crossover of all time. Really because the album's appeal comes down to songwriting more than it does volume or aggression, which are great. It's part of what makes some of their early work so amazing, but it's great to hear that Metallica has matured in their songwriting a little bit on this record. It's great to hear that the band had more to offer than just thrash metal to its fans. The track listing on this thing is excellent and versatile. The band drops one fantastic ballad after another, Wherever I May Roam, The Unforgiven, Nothing Else Matters. And even though this album is self-titled, the fact that a lot of people call it the Black Album is very fitting, because these songs, even the harder and heavier ones, show a darker side of Metallica. Take the song The Struggle Within, for example, which, I mean, is all about just kind of introspectively suffering over anger and resentment, as well as depression. And then The God That Failed, which is a song about James Hetfield's mother. She had died of cancer because she refused medical treatment based on her religious beliefs and decided to pray instead. And it's just really intense to think that that situation is fueling like the incredibly bleak and despondent emotions on this track. This track and many other tracks on here, given the lyrics and the topics, are absolutely soul-shredding. And because it's Metallica, because we don't typically think of Metallica as a dark band or a band that addresses super dark topics, I don't think this album gets, credit for approaching these topics in the way that it does. And while some of the thrashier tracks on this record aren't quite as intense or as fast as some of the band's most celebrated material, the riffs are still insanely catchy, even if they are sort of measured. Of Wolf and Man, Through the River, of course Enter Sandman, arguably the band's biggest single, and the song Don't Tread on Me is just kind of like grand, large-scale badassery. Since their album And Justice for All, Metallica hasn't written an album that wasn't like at least an hour, and I would say the Black Album easily stands as their best solid hour of music. While it's not quite as invigorating as their 80s material, it's easily one of their best records and one of the most important metal albums of all time, and the production is pretty excellent too. The instrumentation is balanced, it's beautiful. Lars's drumming is dramatic, it's primal, the bass is incredibly audible. James' singing on this thing is expressive, it's gruff, it's soulful. This is a mature, well-crafted album, and in a way, it's Metallica hitting an artistic peak. This record is one of those instances where you do want to really believe the hype, because it's a big album, it's a popular album for a reason. Metallica 1984 Ride the Lightning sophomore album. This record was a huge improvement on the band's debut, Kill Them All. The band was showing themselves to be way more versatile and dynamic than they had been in the past. From the sparkling acoustic intro on the song Fight Fire with Fire to the throttling, heavy, intense, and pummeling riffs and drums that run throughout pretty much every track here. I mean, this album really does live up to its electrifying title from beginning to end. Also, James Hetfield's devilish growls on this thing, the crunchy, chugging guitar tone. And a lot of the tracks here are more than just kind of straightforward thrash and bash aggressive metal songs. There are a lot of well-crafted and epic intros, outros, and segues on a lot of these cuts. The soaring guitar leads on the title track, I mean, friggin' For Whom the Bell Tolls, that intro is fantastic. The ominous arpeggios on the Call of Cthulhu, and the song Fade to Black is easily the band's first amazing ballad. And also the song Escape, for as hard and as aggressive as it is, it's really anthemic. The production on this thing for the 1980s is incredible, it's vivid, it's loud, it's full, it's powerful, and the experience of this music is so incredibly physical. This thing is also no BS and no frills at 47 minutes long. It's one of the band's most tight and perfect track lists. Truly a defining album for thrash metal and Metallica. And this album is also kind of a show of just how smart and intricate thrash metal can be, as a lot of the riffs on this thing are kind of creative. There's some weird little harmonious embellishments here and there that kind of make them more interesting than, your average, power chord style riffs. I don't have a lot to say about this album beyond that. I just think it's a great record. I mean, it's so great it just kind of sells itself. And finally, in my opinion, Metallica's best album, hands down, has to be Master of Puppets. Now, I don't have a lot to say about this album, and not that I don't care about this album that much, or not that I don't think there isn't a lot to say, but a lot of what I said about Ride the Lightning kind of applies to this record as well, but you have these subtle improvements on just about everything that kind of just inches this record past its predecessor. The performances were certainly more intense, the songs were catchier. It seems like there was a more sort of cohesive lyrical theme to the entire record, talking about war and violence, military service people, like on Disposable Heroes, mental health on Sanitarium. It's just kind of a perfect thrash metal album. Every riff, every drum fill, every vocal performance, amazing instrumental passages on tracks like Orion and Leper Messiah. And again, another thing that made its predecessor amazing, the track list is just so tight. There's not a whole lot of room for BS here. The band doesn't overdo it. Production's amazing. I mean, some of my favorite songs on here, Battery! It's just pure adrenaline, but there's an emotional depth to it at times as well that's very satisfying. It's far from just being a one-note thrash album. You do have that blood-pumping aggression, you have have that little side of emotion. You do have thoughtful themes coming through on the lyrics. There's just a lot to it. There's a lot of layers to this record. There's very little in the way of any missteps or what I would consider to be mistakes or bad writing choices, bad production choices. And I just think this is Metallica at their highest, purest thrash metal point. And that's going to be it. That is my Metallica worst to best. Let me know what you guys thought. Hit me down in the comments and tell me what are your worst to best Metallica albums. List them out yourself. And I will see you guys in the next worst to best, which I'm going to be working on soon. Hopefully it doesn't come out a long time from now because these are time consuming. Transition. Have you given all of these albums a listen? Over here next to my head is a Metallica review that you should check out, or you can click on the link to subscribe to the channel. I love you guys. Thanks for watching again. Appreciate you guys following me and everything, and I don't know, that's it. I love music, and I love you. Forever.